Hello and welcome to MS Auto Live. Today I have a very special guest, Mike Neilson, aka the Drumming DBA. Today we are going to talk about the importance of database administration and a day in the life of a DBA. So Mike, welcome. How are you?
Not too bad, mate. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I am fine. So this is my classical question. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yep, so my name's Mike Neilson, the drumming DBA. I'm from Leeds in the UK, where it's very cold at the moment. And so I'm a DBA at the moment. I haven't always been a DBA. I've been a DBA for about 5 years now, and I came from a non-IT background. So I started life as a baggage handler at Leeds and Bradford Airport in the United Kingdom, and I worked my way up through various roles. I worked a bit in Australia as well, as a baggage handler at Sydney Airport in Australia when I had a year out travelling, and then I came back and I got a job for an airline over here, but working as a navigational flight planner in the office. So I moved from outside to moving suitcases and pushing planes around to moving inside. I became a navigational flight planner. So that was looking after the route network for the airline. I worked my way up to the flight planning supervisor role, looking after a team of up to 7 people. And then I moved into flight operations, where I was looking after the EFB project, which was the electronic flight bag project, which was basically the iPad, which was, we were transforming the cockpit into a paperless cockpit, moving away from all the paper manuals. And in this role, I was liaising with pilots, senior management, software developers, and I also had a secondment role in Brussels, where I was co-chair of the call sign confliction user group. And this was working with air traffic controllers, pilots, and software developers to come up with a web app that airlines could log into, and they could enter in their seasonal data, and it would deconflict all the possible conflictions for all the flights in and out of Europe in that season. And we delivered that software solution so that, you know, when airlines were giving out the call signs to the pilots on a daily basis, they wouldn't get the confliction in the sky, because you can imagine the confusion if 2 planes have the same call sign. It can be quite dangerous. So I worked on that project, and then I was EFB project manager at the same time. And I was doing that, and then something changed in my life. My wife got pregnant with our first daughter, and I thought it was time for a change in career. I'd always been into computers. I was never a console person. I was always into computers. So my first computer was a Commodore 64, and then Amiga 500 and stuff like that. And I'd always sort of wanted to get into computers and tech. I didn't go to university, didn't do very well at college. So I never had any really sort of hard skills to fall back onto. All my skills were like what you consider soft skills. So I started looking at different languages and stuff. And then I was lucky enough to fall into a database administrator role, which I'll talk about how I got into that later. And I've been doing that for 5 years.
Okay, great. So I want to ask you a very short question, but I know it's a very long answer. So what's a DBA?
Okay, so a DBA, it's an abbreviation for database administrator. And, you know, you'll probably get a different answer from every DBA. And fundamentally, they'll probably all say the same thing. But it depends what that DBA does on a daily basis, obviously. But to me, a DBA is someone who ensures that, you know, the data in a company's databases is as secure as possible, and it can be accessed the most efficient way possible, whether that's by users or programs or customers using the website at the front end and stuff like that. And it's very critical. It's a critical role being a DBA. You're essentially the guardians of the data. And for me, a DBA, where really, it starts and ends with us when it comes to the security of the data and the provisioning of the data in terms of the speed and stuff like that. And of course, then you've got to take into consideration things like RPO, recovery point objective, RTO, recovery time objective, and you might have different SLAs as well that you have to adhere to internally, externally, governmentally, and stuff like that. And so you have to adhere to all these things. We just had GDPR rolled out here in Europe, and so that's all about personally identifiable information and stuff. So you have to make sure that all the data is secure in that way as well. And fundamentally, you've got to have your backups ready and be able to restore them, and depending on what your backup strategy is, in accordance with what the company expects in terms of what their downtime can be. But for me, the DBA role is changing. Some DBAs will do this already, but some DBAs won't, or they'll be transitioning to it. But what I mean is, a lot of DBAs will work with purely on-prem stuff. So by on-prem, I mean you host SQL Server on your servers locally, so in your building, and you might just look after that. But then now we have stuff like Azure becoming more and more prominent, and other cloud services like AWS and stuff like that. And DBAs are becoming more, there's more of an expectancy now for DBAs to know about the cloud, and to also know about things like Windows Server and virtual machines. And it doesn't just stop there. Depending on the size of your company, you may have a team of BI people, and they might look after the reports and the data warehousing. But in my team that I'm in at the moment, it's not a big team. So the DBAs look after the reporting and the analysis services and the integration services. So the packages that run jobs or reports and stuff like that. And we look after the data warehousing as well. And of course, it's not purely limited to SQL Server, which is a Microsoft product. You may also look after Oracle, Teradata, Power BI, and then the other services within, such as reporting services, integration services, analysis services. So it can be a whole myriad of things. In some companies, DBAs are sort of very linear, and they will just look after the databases in terms of, backup and restores, security, making sure that all the versions are up to date and stuff like that. But in other companies, it can be very wide and varied, for everything that I've just covered. So I think it depends on where you work, but that's like a broad overview.
Okay, so there are lots of options in IT, for example, system administration, software development, and DevOps, network security, BI, and so on. So why did you choose database administration?
So I sort of touched on it earlier, that my background for, over 10 years, probably nearly 15 years basically, was working in operations, and that was mainly starting off in ground operations for an airline and then moving through into flight operations. And that's what I knew basically. I was sort of, operations was my life, and I knew a lot about it and how it all works and stuff like that. And I spent a long time building up this career, networking, etc. And my job used to involve in the, for the EFB role, it used to involve being in the cockpit a lot, flying around Europe, working with the pilots and stuff. And then my wife got pregnant with our first daughter. So this is about 5 years ago only now. So it's not that long ago even. And I thought she's going to be coming home with coding homework, in like 7 years. Because I had a friend who had a daughter who was in primary school here in the UK. So primary school here is about ages 5 to 11. And they were coming home with coding for homework. And I thought, well, I don't know any coding. I better start learning because, I don't want to be not able to help my daughter when she's coming home with this homework. So I emailed someone in the DBA team where I worked, and I asked them, what language should I learn? I'm looking to learn a language and possibly the systems around it. I had no idea what a DBA was. And this is only 5 years ago. I had no idea what a database was, let alone what indexes were or anything like that. And so they kindly replied to me and said, you should learn T-SQL. And I was like, oh, what's T-SQL? I had no idea. I'd heard of stuff like Java and HTML, like we all have. Those of us that hadn't worked in IT before, you hear these words and stuff. But I hadn't heard of T-SQL, and I hadn't heard of SQL Server or anything like that. So I had a few communications, and I started looking at it, and I thought, that looks too hard. And also, I had a very busy career in flight operations, so I certainly didn't have time to start learning all this really complicated stuff. And anyway, I kept looking at it, and I kept thinking I should really give that a go. And then one day, a junior DBA role came up in the team, so in the same company that I was working for. And the guys in the team said, you should apply for this junior DBA role. And so I thought long and hard about it. And I'd say this to anyone sort of listening, really. The main reason I chose to be a DBA was because at the time I was 32, and the retirement age for all of us, but especially here in England, is getting longer and longer. Obviously, the longer people live and stuff. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to be probably in work for the next 35 years, which is longer than what I've currently been alive. And so I should really, learn this skill. And so I saw this as a great opportunity, really, to future-proof myself, if nothing else, because I didn't have, like I said, I never went to university, didn't do great at college. And so I saw this as like a real opportunity to future-proof myself going forwards, and especially not only in the short term, but it was for the long term, essentially. And so I applied for the junior DBA role and went for the interview, and I was lucky enough to be offered it. And so I accepted, and I essentially shut the door on my life as I knew it in terms of my career. So I'd been, like I say, in operations for the last 15 years, and I just said goodbye to it. And I had a complete sea change of career, which at that age, I guess, you're not old, but you're not young, and it's quite a big decision to completely change career, because it was a complete change. But I went for it. And initially, I thought, what have I done? Because there was so much to learn. And because I was doing it as a job as well as learning it at the same time, it just seemed overwhelming. And, what I'd say to anyone out there, because obviously this talk is aimed at people wanting to become a DBA, or who might be thinking of becoming a DBA. This talk is not a deep dive into the ins and outs of being a DBA and the technicalities and stuff. So there might be people watching it who are DBAs and stuff, but just bear with me. This is more aimed at people who don't do what we do at the minute and maybe thinking about doing it. So yeah, so what I'd say is it does feel overwhelming when you first do it because there's so much to take in and it is like a foreign language. But if you ask any DBA that when they first started, they felt exactly the same. And I've spoken to people that even did, computer science or computer related degrees at university or mathematics related degrees at university. And they even say that when they first started, it's difficult. So I would say, I gave myself a really hard time about sort of not picking it up as quick as I'd like to. And I think if I'd had my time again, I'd be a lot more kind to myself. So I'd give that piece of advice for anyone out there who's thinking about it. Within reason, just take your time and don't scare yourself with stuff. So I stuck at it, and I had some good people around me in the team, and I had a good manager. And because I was in the same company, I sort of had the domain knowledge already for a lot of the stuff. So I knew a lot of the stuff they were referring to when they were talking about stuff, which was handy because, you go to a new company, you have to learn all the domain stuff to do with that company. So that's a lot to digest at the same time. But I kept working at it. And, there's a lot of times where, because I had a young baby, I was, I was questioning my choice if it was the right thing. But luckily I've got a very supportive family, a very supportive wife, and I had good colleagues. And, the community as well is great. The DBA community is fantastic, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, at big events like SQL Bits, and then the smaller community events. And so really I just threw myself in to it as much as I could, going to SQL Bits, going to talks, and reading as much as I could, and then just putting myself forward for stuff at work. And I just kept going, and in the end it seems to be paying off. I switched companies last summer. So I was a junior, obviously, when I started, and then I took a mid-level job last year. But it is a very rewarding job. It's difficult because it can be very technical, but it's very rewarding. And if you take the time to study and take the time to understand, there's a lot of enjoyment to be had out of the job.
Okay, great. So it's time to ask some more technical questions. And what are the most common tasks performed as a DBA?
Yeah, so again, we're just going to go high level here. Unfortunately today I've not got any demos, or we're not going to do a deep dive or anything like that. So I guess the whole point of, I have a blog, which is the Drumming DBA, and it's in a very similar style to this chat that I'm having with you, Mert, in that I want to aim what I'm saying at people like me, like I was 5 years ago, because as we both know, as people who've worked in IT and who do work in IT, there is so much out there for deep dives and, technical papers and forums, and, there's everything. If you want to go deep on something, then, there's plenty of stuff for that. But when I first started out, I couldn't find a lot of stuff that was sort of at my level, let's say. And so the way I try and aim stuff now is at people who might be in my position that where I was 5 years ago. So I'm going to run through some things here. And again, they're not particularly in any order. There is probably a little hierarchy to them. So any DBAs watching, please don't write in to chastise me for the order being wrong. And again, it's very high level. So we're not going to get into types of things and how you do stuff like that. maybe do that another time. But for me, so common tasks performed by a DBA, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. First and foremost, we touched on this earlier, and it's database backup and recovery. So just as the way that people back up their phones now, you know, or you back up your Windows computer or your Mac, it's a real common occurrence now. You know, like everybody backs things up. They don't have to be technical because you usually get prompts for it. So it works pretty much in a very similar way, simplistically. You back up the database so that if anything goes wrong, you can restore the copy of that database to get you back up and running again. Obviously, it goes a lot more detailed than that, and especially the bigger the companies with more sort of service level agreements, and they make more money. And if they're a 24/7 company and stuff like that, you know, it can get very technical, understandably, because it needs to be. But essentially, backup and recovery, so backup and restores, are probably the most fundamental thing, because if you're not backing up the databases, and then your server blows up, you might have a brand new server come in, but if you don't have any database to restore to it, then it can be very bad, as you can understand. So first and foremost, I'd say backup and recovery is very important. Secondly, security. So DBAs, we look after the security. You probably work with, depending on the size of your company, you probably work with a security officer and potentially some other security type roles, depending on the size of your company. Or it might just be the DBAs. The security might fall completely on the DBAs. Again, it depends on size. But when I say security, you know, essentially I'm talking about who accesses the database and why, you know, who accesses the data and why, or what is accessing the database and why. And so there's this thing called the principle of least privilege, which is essentially, you know, being that you give the least amount of privilege to someone or something as possible, but they can still run the task that they need to. So essentially, you know, you're not giving them, you know, the top level so they can do everything, because obviously they could potentially be looking at stuff they're not allowed to look at. They could be running queries against the database that could cause massive performance issues. There could be all sorts of implications. So in SQL Server, you can do things with security, which means you can sort of really lock down people. You can put them into groups and give that group a certain set of permissions onto a view, which is, you know, not directly onto a database and stuff. So, you know, you have to work through things like that, because essentially, as a database administrator, like I touched on at the start, you are the guardian of the data. So you are responsible for the data housed within those databases. So security is very important. And also, obviously, keeping up with all the latest sort of guidelines. So when GDPR came in a couple of years ago, all the companies had to change their databases to make sure that all the personally identifiable information was masked in the way that it met with the law and stuff like that. So you have to go through, look at encryption and all that sort of thing. So, you know, security covers a whole myriad of things, but it's essential to what a DBA does. Next, software installation and maintenance. So by that, I mean installing SQL Server and maintaining it, updating it. SQL Server, like most software products, has a set time, a set lifespan, if you like, in terms of support and stuff like that. So when they bring out a new version of SQL Server, roughly about every 2 to 3 years. Then these sort of much older ones will start running out of support and stuff like that, extended support. So by that I mean, depending on what sort of license you have, when you buy the licenses for SQL Server, you'll have an agreement with Microsoft where you can go to them with certain problems and stuff. But once it's out of support, you can't necessarily go to them anymore. So you have to make sure that the software is all compliant. The latest updates are all installed. So just as if if you have an Apple iPhone, a new iOS update comes out, and by and large you'll download it and it'll update your phone. So it's the same way with SQL Server. Updates come up for SQL Server because it will be a bug fix or something else that's been found. So updates will come out, and it's just making sure that all those updates are installed and they're on there as well. And you also might have to provision Windows servers with SQL Server installed on them. So it can be, depending on what your role is as DBA, installation and maintenance can cover many things, and you might have to install reporting services, integration services, Power BI, and then it doesn't just stop with Microsoft. You might have to install and maintain Oracle, Teradata. So it can suddenly become a very long list of things. But essentially, just keeping that estate up to date. I'd say next is capacity planning. So by this, I mean you are monitoring your estate to essentially check for disk space growth and other areas of growth that you might be running out, and you need to ensure that you preempt that before you actually get to it, because you don't want everything to get full and then you realize and everything stops working. So you might need a new server spinning up, or you might have an old server lying around in the background that you could use. But essentially using different tools or setting up reports to basically keep an eye on your estate for you, so that you don't get any nasty surprises. Because if you're loading a lot of data in, or there's a program loading a lot of data in, it can grow your disk quite rapidly, and so if you're not prepared for that, it can cause issues. Next, I'd say related to that, performance monitoring. So there's a couple of ways. Well, there's a lot of ways you can monitor performance with SQL Server, but one of them is called Perfmon, or Performance Monitor, which comes with SQL Server, and essentially that works off metrics from the system tables and other tables within SQL Server, and you can monitor and run traces on things that you want to run. So if there's a particular transaction that people believe is causing you problems, you can set a trace going, and then you can get someone to run that, and you can see what it's doing whilst it's running. So you're running traces and stuff like that. And then you obviously have third-party tools which you can monitor performance with as well. So performance monitoring, I guess capacity planning is your long term, whereas performance monitoring is sort of like the here and now. So you'll have alerts set up for what's happening on the database right there and then. So if you have a long running transaction that's causing issues, you should be able to see that in your performance tuning and try and fix it before it causes any issues. So for example, you might have a long running transaction or a database that has a lock on the database. So when customers are trying to do a search, the search is coming in, but because this long running transaction has a lock on the database, the search is timing out at the front end where the customer is watching. So you need to find out what is causing this lock, and your performance monitoring should monitor that and alert you when stuff like this is happening. So you can go in, you can see what this is causing the lock, and then you can probably get rid of it, which frees up the transaction, the searches to come back onto the database. So that's just one aspect of performance monitoring, but there's a lot to it. And then I'd say lastly, troubleshooting. So this really sort of encompasses all the things that we've spoken about in what I've just sort of said. In the troubleshooting, no day is the same being a database administrator, and that's something I absolutely love about the job. And troubleshooting could be absolutely anything. You can have people coming to you regarding queries running slow on a database. It could be it's slow to extract data from a data warehouse. A report might be timing out in reporting services, or they might just need some help with some code that they've written. You know, and that can be on SQL Server, it could be on Oracle, it could be on Teradata, it could be where two services talk to each other. So I've got a package I've got a sys package that pulls data from Teradata into SQL Server. It then puts that into a database, and then that database is read from Power BI, and a report is spun up in Power BI, and I then have that report mail out to people. So there's a lot of parts to that chain. So you can just see from there, you know, troubleshooting, if something went wrong there's a lot of bits of the chain to unpick and to investigate. So troubleshooting can be extremely varied, which is one of the reasons I love being a DBA.
Okay, so you have lots of work to do in your
Yes.
work day.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a role play. And I am working as software engineer at your company, and one of our customers say our application has a bad performance, and as a developer say no, it's not from me, it's not about the application, and it is database fault. And what will your troubleshooting process be?
So, yeah, I mean, I guess again, everyone's style is different. So, you know, ADBA is watching, you probably got a different way to me. So I'm not saying this is the right way, but if you came to me, firstly, I'd ask you what sort of issue you were seeing, and where. So what server, what program you were trying to run, or if you were trying to run a program, or you know, if you were trying to run an application, or you were trying to call something. And by call, I mean, you know, one program is trying to reach a database, or one program is trying to reach another program which relies on a database. And then I'd ask you if you've got an error message, because error messages can be extremely useful, because if you're not a DBA, you might struggle to describe something to a DBA in terms of how we understand it. Whereas an error message is sort of, we understand the error messages, as anyone does in their own particular line of work. You know, everyone sort of understands their own error messages and stuff like that. But I'd ask you for an error message, what your problem is and where you're seeing it, and if there's a server involved. And then I'd go away and I'd see if I could connect to that server, see if it's up. Because sometimes when Windows patches go on and stuff like that, servers don't restart, or the SQL service on the server can sometimes not restart. So sometimes it can seem like the end of the world, but it's just because the SQL service hasn't restarted on a particular server. So just go in and look at the sort of the standard things to begin with. And then if that all then seems to sort of be up and running, you can go into the SQL Server error logs. So in the GUI on Management Studio, there's the management folder, and then in there you've got your SQL Server logs, and they log pretty much everything that happens to SQL Server on that server. And so you can get a pretty good picture, and not everything, they don't log everything, but they log a lot of things, and you can get a pretty good picture of what's happened. So you can see what's happened, what events have happened up to the point where maybe we're seeing what's causing your particular issue. There's other areas you can look at as well, like you can look at TempDB to see the events on there for what's been added to TempDB in sort of the last period of time. Sometimes that can be useful. There are commands like sp who is active and sp who to, so sp underscore who's active and sp underscore who to, which you can run in the command window or the query window, sorry, on SQL Server, and that'll bring up a list of everything and everyone that's running on a SQL Server, on the SQL Server. And so you can see if something's running, and it'll tell you on there what's blocking stuff as well. So depending on what you're telling me, if I run sp underscore who's active or sp underscore who to, I can potentially see if something's blocking your transaction or your transaction's blocking something else. You know, and then going on from there, really, we can look at, depending on what your issue is, I would then help you try and rectify what the issue was. So not just rectifying it there and then, but for example, if your table that's causing the issue doesn't have any indexes on it, you know, might consider putting some indexes on there. It's not always the case, and you have to be very careful with what types of index that you put on tables. And we won't get into indexes this time, but there are different types of there's a lot of different types of indexes that you can be used on tables. Two of the common types are clustered index and non-clustered index, but there's a lot more as well, depending on what you're doing. Indexes aren't always the answer, and if you put a wrong index on a table or a column, that can also cause you pain. But then just work with the developer or whoever reported the issue and just work through. Often it's the case that you'll get one error message, you'll fix something, and then you'll get another error message. But error messages aren't necessarily a bad thing. So when I first started as a DBA, I used to think error messages were bad, and they're not, because they're giving you clues to what you're trying to fix. And then lastly, but there's obviously a lot more other things as well, but lastly, there's the Windows server logs as well. So if you've got access to the box itself, you can log onto the box and you can get up the Windows application log, or the Windows logs. You can look at the application log, and it'll write errors for SQL Server to the Windows log as well, and that can be really useful in terms of digging down, troubleshooting, obviously depending on the error and stuff. But I think that's overlooked quite a lot, the Windows log and the application logs and stuff like that. But that can be very handy when used in conjunction with everything else that I've just spoken about.
Okay, so thanks to open source, there are lots of third-party tools that we can use in our work. So what are your favorite third-party database tools? Do you have any?
Yeah, so obviously being a DBA, you know, there are tools out there which third parties make to make our lives easier. A lot of them will just work off the SQL Server engine and not be presented as a GUI at the front end, but essentially they're working off systems tables and stuff like that in the background. But to get that information that you need, you know, as a starter or as a beginner or as a junior, you might not necessarily know the code to get exactly what you want, because you might have to join tables and cross apply and all sorts of stuff like that. So you're getting into the realms of more complicated T-SQL. So we have third-party apps. And again, if you're up against the time and stuff like that, if you have managers expecting you to get things sort of back online, you know, obviously third-party tools really help. So some of my favorites, first is a product called AirForge, which is spelled AIREFORGE. That's AirForge. And that is a Windows application that it's packed full of loads of powerful tools for managing SQL Server, basically. There's many different tools in it, but my favorite tool, which is also available in the free community version, is the comparison tool. And I use this a lot for investigating. So, for example, if you want to see, you may have 12 SQL servers and you want to see what version they're all running, because management have asked you, you know, what version of SQL Server are they running? What version of Windows are they on? You might want to know if the memory is the same, because, you know, in a real world example, you want your production database, your UAT environment, and your test environment within reason to be, you know, fairly identical, because obviously the whole point of testing is that, you know, you test, then up to UAT, and then up to production. And by the time it gets to production, you want to be extremely confident that the testing you've done, it won't break in production. And so one of the ways to achieve this is obviously to make sure that everything is sort of similar on the way up. And so, you know, you might want to check the memory, the amount of cores, all that sort of thing. And you might also want to check the jobs that are on there. So you might want to see if all the servers have the same jobs, and then you can even drill down into the job steps. And there's so much that you can compare. So you select the servers that you want to compare. So you might want to compare all 12. You might just want to compare a certain 3, and you tick them, and then you hit the comparison button at the top. And you can also, before you run the comparison, you can select what you want to compare. So you can run a full comparison if you want to look at the whole servers. But then if you just want to look at certain things, then you can tick the certain things that you want to look at as well. And then you run that comparison, and then at the end, it brings up, and then you can filter down through the things that you want to filter, and you can pick through. And it's really brilliant because it's all just presented in a GUI. And so, you know, I think it's absolutely brilliant for that. There's other things in there as well, like an optimize tool, which I'm yet to look at, but, you know, I love using AirForge. For monitoring, I really like Sentry One. So it used to be called SQL Sentry, but now it's called Sentry One, and that's essentially a monitoring tool, which has a very intuitive GUI on the front end. Not everyone uses it. Obviously, different DBAs like different tools, but I like that one for monitoring. So, you know, you can see in sort of, it has all the graphs in terms of what your CPU is doing, how many queries are running, you know, lots and lots of different statistics. And then you can drill down, you can do it across different times and stuff. So if you wanted to look at something at a specific time, you change the time to that, and then all the different tabs will be for that time. So very good for investigating, and also for watching things in real time as well. So if you're about to run something onto, you know, if you're doing a big data load into a database, and you want to watch what's going to happen, you can get the server up on Century 1, and you can watch it as the data is being loaded in. And then obviously if anything starts looking like it's suddenly shooting up, you can stop that because you're watching it in real time. So that's really handy to have. A couple more on the automation side, DBA Tools. It's a big community for DBA tools. I was lucky enough to work with one of the guys from DBA Tools called Rob Sewell. And so he works in our team and he writes a lot of the modules for it. Essentially works off PowerShell modules. And then at the sort of front end, which you can run in Visual Studio, when you install the DBA Tools module, you can run sort of one line of code with different parameters. And if you want to do a restore or you want to deploy VMs with a certain build of SQL Server on, it's really good for sort of, as long as you've got your modules in the background, which is a lot of work, at the sort of front end, as it were, you can just give that code to someone and they can run it, which is really handy because you don't necessarily want people messing around with code and stuff like that. So DBA Tools, massive community for that. It's very much community driven. It's massively sort of open source, so people contribute to it and stuff like that. It's not just one person doing it. And it's a brilliant sort of addition to a DBA's tool belt, as it were. And then lastly, I really liked using Octopus. So Octopus is an automated deployment tool software. So it's essentially a piece of software, and it's a front end GUI. Again, it works primarily off SQL or PowerShell in the background, but this is sort of really good because you can schedule things in and you can give it to developers if you want them to do. If developers want the ability to be able to restore test environments, you can give them Octopus and they can schedule in when they want the refresh, and they just schedule it in on the GUI and hit a button, and they don't have to mess around with code and anything like that. So as DBAs, you don't really want developers messing around with your code. So stuff like Octopus is really good. So I'd say those are probably my favorites, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. So you are using Microsoft SQL Server, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, there are lots of database technologies. Why did you choose SQL Server? Is there any specific reason?
Yes, I mean, like I sort of touched on at the beginning, when I first got in touch with the DBA team at my work to ask about what language should I learn, they said T-SQL. So that's Microsoft's version of structured query language. There are many versions of it. So Oracle is, I think, PL SQL. And then there's obviously different versions. There's NoSQL and stuff like that. But yes, so it was the first contact I had with a type of structured query language. And then when I became a junior, the shop that I worked in was Microsoft SQL Server. So it was my first experience of working with a database management system and a structured query language. So, but I guess it probably is the most widely used at the minute, I would say. Maybe others are catching it up, or I might be wrong. Another version, another type might be more used, but I think it's pretty much up there in terms of, you know, who uses it out there in the DBA community and companies and stuff like that. So if you learn it, I don't think you'll struggle to get a job, but obviously do learn other structured query languages and NoSQL and stuff like that as well. But now I use Teradata and Oracle as well, which I've been learning in my current role. So, you know, Teradata is a little bit different in terms of the GUI and the structure in the terms of the catalog in the background, stuff like that. The system tables and the views. The language is a tiny little bit different as well. And Oracle, again, just a little different nuances. Oracle is really, obviously, very widely used throughout the world. So Oracle, the GUI is just a little bit different again, and the language is slightly different to T-SQL, but it's not too dissimilar. So yeah, the reason it was Microsoft's SQL Server was because that's what I was first introduced to.
Okay, I have to confess this. I don't like SSMS, and I prefer using Azure Data Studio because I am not a DBA and I don't need lots of features. So I wonder, do you use any other software than SSMS to work with SQL Server?
Yeah, so I can totally understand why you don't like SSMS, because as a dev, I wouldn't really expect you to work in Management Studio. And yeah, Azure Data Studio is obviously, it's sort of the way things are going. And, I think Microsoft are being quite keen to push people that way, because Azure is becoming more and more prevalent. I guess a sort of somewhere in between, and it's something that I use. I do predominantly work in Management Studio because I'm a DBA, but I do also work quite heavily in Visual Studio. So I guess this would be a sort of a middle between Management Studio and Azure Data Studio. It looks a bit more modern, I would say, than Management Studio. In terms of the way it works, the GUI and the setup and stuff. You can connect to servers in it just as you can in Management Studio. It's more aimed at writing code, writing T-SQL, than sort of managing the database on a day-to-day basis, which you would use Management Studio for. But I do really like Visual Studio, which is a Microsoft product, for deploying, DDL, which is, create statements. So when you're first creating databases or environments and stuff, it's good for deploying because you can do comparisons in it. So it's got a comparison tool, not in the same way that I talked about the comparison earlier. That's completely different. By this, I mean, you can do things like schema compares. So you can take what you call a DAC pack of one environment on one server, and you can take a DAC pack of another environment from another server, and you can do what's called a schema compare on Visual Studio, and it will list the differences, and then you can create a script from that, and you can run that script on, and it will essentially update the two environment or one environment so it now matches and stuff. So it's very handy for stuff like that. Deploy sys packages, so integration service packages, reporting services, stuff, and analysis services, all deployed through Visual Studio. And you can build up reports in there. You can create integration services packages through new projects and solutions as well. So again, all that, it's aimed more at developers and stuff, but in terms of deployment, when you're doing promotes through environments, it's very useful for stuff like that. So I do like using Visual Studio.
Okay, great. Me too. So do you have any certifications?
I do, yeah. So last summer, I sat and passed my 7764 exam, which it's actually been shelved now. As of January this year, they've actually stopped it. Luckily, I believe my certification is still valid, I hope. But they discontinued being able to sit that exam because Microsoft are now pushing people more towards the sort of the role-based certifications. So yes, I do have a certification, which I'm extremely proud of, because I I didn't go to university, and I didn't do very well at college. So I had high school certifications, but that's not really sort of going to do you any good when you're trying to progress in IT. And considering that I knew nothing about being a DBA 5 years before that, so I'd gone from in pretty much 4 years to not knowing anything about databases to essentially passing my 7764 exam, which is administering a database. And it's quite a tricky exam. I would, senior DBAs and people who've been doing this job 10, 20 odd years would probably pass it. But for someone like me that had, only been doing the job for 4 years, for me, it was a massive achievement. I was absolutely ecstatic that I got that certification. And it did help me a lot. If anyone's thinking about taking certifications, I'd say go for it anyway, because the things that, obviously think about the ones that you want to take and make sure it's applicable to your role or the role that you want to do. But I'd encourage people to plan to take them, because the things that you study whilst you're studying for that exam will help you in your role. And I learned a lot studying for the exam, and a lot of stuff that I wouldn't normally do day to day, that has since, I've used things from the exam that I now do day to day and stuff like that I probably wouldn't have known if I hadn't have studied for it. So even if you don't pass, it's not the end of the world. Often you get one free retry depending on who you booked your exam through. They're not that expensive. If you've got a nice employer, they might pay for you to study the exam and take the exam. But it's a very good learning experience, and just give yourself plenty of time to study for them as well, because if you're working as well as studying, and if you come in from a background that's like mine that wasn't so technical, it can be a lot to take in. And the textbooks are quite thick, and there's a lot of, you try and find out something on YouTube, and depending on the topic, there can be millions of videos on YouTube about the same subject, and some of them can tell you the wrong information, and so it can be quite overwhelming. So again, just use the community. If you're thinking about taking exams, put a tweet out on Twitter asking people what they advise and stuff, and if you put hashtag SQL family in there, you'll generally get a good response, and listen to what these people are saying, because they're the DBAs and they've done the certifications and they know, because it can be overwhelming. But I'd encourage anyone to do at least one certification, because like I say, the things that you learn whilst you're studying are sort of invaluable, really. And if you pass it, obviously you become certified, so that helps progress your career and stuff like that. I'm now planning to do sort of an Azure path, so I'm going to start with the AZ900, which is the Azure fundamentals, which by all accounts I've been told is easy, but it's only easy if you know the answers. So I'm going to aim for that one first, and then I'm going to see which path that I want to go down, because more and more Azure exams are coming out. So I'm just going to see if I can get past that one first, and then keep moving on with the Azure certifications. But certifications are not a bad thing. It's a lot of effort to get there, but it's worth it once you have it. Some employers won't employ you unless you are certified. Some places it doesn't matter. Some it's sort of halfway. They like you to have certifications, but it's not it's not the last thing in the world. So just sort of have a read and have a look.
Okay, so what challenges may I face as a DBA?
Well, as we sort of touched on, it can be extremely varied. So this is one of the things that I absolutely love about being a DBA, is that no 2 days are ever the same. They might be similar, but they're not the same. And, you know, like I said, you can experience a whole manner of things. So challenges can include, you know, things that are directly related to the database and the database server, people's permissions, who's accessing the SQL Server, what they want from it and stuff like that. Troubleshooting performance problems. So you might have a live issue where it's causing your website, your company's website, to slow down, and you have to sort of jump on that straight away. So you have to be sort of not afraid of a little bit of stress, sometimes a lot of stress. Sometimes it can be a stressful job, I'm not going to lie. But if you don't mind that, or you can be calm in those sort of situations, because it can be a lot of pressure depending on the size of the company you work for. You know, if you're looking after €1 billion e-commerce system, then obviously there's a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility there. If you're the only DBA in, say, a lawyer firm, and you're looking after, you know, a couple of databases on one server that lives under your desk, then although that's still as important to that company, then the pressure may not be as great, because there might not be any time constraints in terms of when you need to get things back up and running, if you're not a 24/7 company and stuff like that. So like I said, you know, it could be helping people with code, it could be managing Windows servers, it could be provisioning and managing virtual machines, all those sorts of things. And also, you know, it's not a 9 to 5 job, Monday to Friday. You know, there are obviously core hours and stuff like that, and it's not a case of, you know, you work nights all the time, but it's sort of expected, because, you know, the systems that we look after, they are up essentially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and they do need people to look after them. So, you know, generally when something happens to a database or a database server, the only person that can fix it is generally a DBA. So it's sort of expected that, you know, the hours can vary and stuff like that. So if you're sort of looking for a steady 9 to 5 job with no stress, then I'd say don't be a DBA. But that's not to put people off, because it's not. For me, it's an enjoyable sort of stress, and I don't mind the hours. You know, in previous roles as a baggage handler, and when I worked in flight ops, I used to work nights and stuff. And you know, I have 2 kids now, so I'm up at all hours, and you know, so the late nights and the early mornings don't bother me, because it's sort of part of my life already. But I would say it's a very, very varied role. It can be very exciting, and it can be very challenging. But if you're prepared to get involved and get stuck in, and you have a good team around you, I think it's one of the best jobs in IT, personally.
Okay, so you said you changed your career and become a DBA, and I think very successful DBA. And I think this is the correct person to ask this question. Do you have any recommendations for who wants to be a DBA?
Yeah, so, you know, I obviously said at the start of this that this talk was aimed at people like me, or like I was 5 years ago, who are potentially thinking about becoming a DBA, or they might be doing some things already that a DBA does, but their title might not be a DBA, and they might be thinking, oh, I like this, you know, maybe I might want to become a DBA. And I'd just say, you know, talk to the people who already do it. If you're thinking of doing it, talk to people that are already involved. So ask questions on Twitter, watch webcasts like this one. There's also now a handful of podcasts out there by experienced DBAs, from names that DBA are famous in the DBA industry to people, you know, sort of more like me who aren't famous but have experience and are just talking about stuff on podcasts. So listen to the podcast, see if you identify with anything that they're saying, if it excites you in any way. Chances are that if you're thinking about becoming a DBA, some of it will excite you and it will interest you. But don't let it overwhelm you. There will be a lot in the beginning that you'll hear things or you'll read things and it will just look like a foreign language, even though it'll be written in your native language. It will look foreign because, you know, it is technical and it is complicated. But, you know, if you're thinking about becoming a DBA, just understand that it is technical and it is complicated, and it can take a while, a long time, to get where you want to go and to understand things. You know, I'd say it's a fine balance between throwing yourself in and getting fully immersed in being a DBA, but trying not to overwhelm yourself at the same time or letting others overwhelm you. You know, try, if you get a junior DBA job, if you're thinking, if you're watching this now and there's a junior DBA role and you're wondering whether to apply for it or not, then maybe in the interview, you know, ask if the company is prepared to mentor you and coach you, because that's really important, that the company does that for you. And not just at junior level, you know, I would expect that all the way up, because we're always learning as DBAs. And even the experienced people will tell you they're always learning. There's always new stuff that they don't know. And it'll be the people above them who are telling them that stuff. And if they're right at the top, it'll be the people they know at Microsoft who work on the development team that are telling them. You know, it's never the case. Nobody knows everything. So I think if you are thinking about applying for a DBA role, in the interview, I would say ask the employer if they would consider coaching you and mentoring you, because you're extremely interested, you're prepared to put the hard work in, but you know, you're going to need help, and you're going to need a mentor or a coach to help you, and you want to be sort of allowed to grow as well. And you know, I think more and more companies are becoming like that, and that's a very good environment to be in. You know, you might not have that. You might just be expected to come in and sort of learn for yourself. You know, if that's the case, just do your best. And again, just reach out to people. Just use the SQL community, the DBA community, because that's what it's there for. And it's a great community, and people will always help each other and help newcomers and stuff like that. But like I say, just try and just take it easy. You know, work hard, obviously, but don't try not to be overwhelmed. Just try to do one thing at a time, and you know, just one step at a time. Because if you look at the big picture, it'll overwhelm you, I think. Whereas if you just try and do one foot in front of the other at a time, you'll get there. And before you know it, you'll have done 1,000 steps, and you know, you'll be coming on nicely. So try not to get overwhelmed by it, and reach out to people like myself, you know, and other people. You know, I'll always be more than happy to speak to people who are thinking about becoming a DBA. I'll answer questions. You know, I'm happy to do video calls and stuff like that. And you know, it's all for free. You know, I just want to help people because I sort of wish I'd have had that when I was first starting out. So I know what it's like. And there are more people out there like that as well who are prepared to chat. I mean, even some of the more established people who, when you get into the DBA world, you'll get to know these people, and they're sort of not famous, but you know, they're well respected in the DBA world. And I chat to some of them now and stuff, become friends with them and stuff. And I, you know, occasionally I'll ask them questions and stuff. And even in their status and stuff, they'll give me the time of day, and they'll sort of give me advice and stuff. So even at that level, people are still prepared to sort of like hand down the experience and stuff. So just don't be afraid to ask. The worst that someone can say is no or go away. But at least if you've asked and you know what the answer is. So just throw yourself in and strap yourself in for the ride.
Okay, great. So, there is a term as accidental DBA. So, what does it mean?
Yeah, so you might hear the term accidental DBA used, and a lot of people will become full-time DBAs this way, but it's essentially, I sort of touched on it real briefly in that last bit, but it's essentially someone who you might work on a service desk or another sort of IT-based role, or not necessarily IT. You might be a business analyst, and you might be expected to work with databases to pull figures for management and stuff like that, or you might pull figures out of a database and put it into Power BI, but you might be a business analyst, so you're not a DBA and you're not really technically sort of a technical IT person. Or you might work on service desk and you might manage some of the SQL servers. You might even manage some of the security around the SQL servers. And so I think the accidental DBA term that's someone who is already touching SQL Server or using SQL, and they think, oh, I quite like this. I'd quite like to, delve a bit further and maybe, see what it's like to use it all the time. And I've heard that, DBA is a role, and a lot of the time people that are accidental DBAs, they don't actually know they're an accidental DBA until they become a DBA, and then they realize, oh, I was doing that stuff in my old job. And I think a lot of people who are accidental DBAs go on to be DBAs, sometimes through choice, or sometimes it'll be through sort of necessity. So you might be the accidental DBA and you might be looking after the SQL servers, and you might outsource the DBA work to, a third party or something. But then the company might decide to bring it in-house, and they might look to you and say, well, you already work with SQL Server, so you're now going to be the DBA. And I've heard stories of it happening like that as well. But that's essentially what an accidental DBA is.
Okay, so let's get to the actual topic. And apart from your DBA career, you also have a music career. And do you have a band now?
I'm not in a band at the moment. So, yes, I've been in a lot of bands. Obviously, my handle is the drumming DBA. So I'm a drummer. I have been playing the drums for 25 years, since I was 12. So I'm not hiding my age. I am 37. But I've been playing since I was 12. And I've been in bands since I was about 13. And I left my last band in April last year, so in April 2020, to basically concentrate on my family and my career. And also, lockdown in the UK and COVID has obviously changed all our lives. But for the music industry, it was a massive change. Obviously, live shows stopped, and a lot of other things sort of happened because of that. Releases stopped because you can't tour to follow up a release and stuff. So I was in a lot of bands, been lucky enough to play all over the world, played in the UK, Australia, all over Europe, in Asia. I was a session drummer in London, lived in London. I was a session drummer down there for an American band. And I've sort of been lucky enough when I've been on tour and when I've just been at festivals and stuff, I've met people like Dave Grohl and Taylor Hawkins and the Foo Fighters, and I've met Slash from Guns N' Roses and Roger Taylor, the drummer from Queen, was at one of our gigs in London. That was Christmas 2019, and that was absolutely crazy. So we knew he was coming, Roger Taylor, the drummer from Queen, and yeah, he was there to see the main band who we were on tour with, but he was there for us, and I was chatting to him afterwards, and I got a picture with him, and I was very lucky to sort of have that life sort of running in parallel to, you know, my careers basically. So my career when I was in flight ops, I was also a musician, sort of in my other life, as it were. And even when I became a DBA, I was a musician as well, a drummer. And in my last band, which was called No Fit State, I was in that band for 2 years. And that was probably the closest I got to sort of making it. And we did everything ourselves. We were complete DIY. We had our own record label. I was the manager, and then we did everything together. So we booked our own gigs. We did our own artwork. We obviously wrote our own songs, and you know, it went really well. You know, to the point where we were going on tour. I've got 2 endorsement deals out of it, so I'm actually endorsed by 2 companies. I have my own drumsticks. I have my own line of drumsticks, and I've got my own heads on my drums and stuff like that. So I'm endorsed by 2 companies, which I still have that endorsement. And, you know, we were touring, we were playing festivals. We played Download Festival here in the UK. So that we played the same festivals as Smashing Pumpkins and stuff like that. And it was great, you know. We got invited to Marshall in Milton Keynes. So Marshall, the people that make the amps, they wanted to sign the band because they have a record label. So we went down there and we got invited down to the museum. We saw all the amps that, you know, Paul Weller had used, and The Who, and all that sort of thing. And even the Spinal Tap gear was there, which was really, really cool to see, all the amps that went up to 11. And it was great. And then, but it was getting to a point where, you know, the band was going to sort of take off, really. And I had obviously a young family with 2 girls and my wife, and I was getting more and more into the DBA role. And it is a demanding job. And so I'd been playing for 25 years, essentially, since 1995. And it was 2020, and I just decided to call it a day, really, on the sort of serious side of music, because I felt like I'd taken it as far as I could. And I really wanted to dedicate myself to my career as a DBA. And also to my family, you know, because I can't go off on tour for a year and stuff like that, because I wouldn't have a job, and, you know, it's not really fair on my family and stuff. So I just decided, you know, I'd taken it as far as I could, and I'd had an absolutely amazing time, and I'd met loads of amazing people, and I'd had loads of experiences. You know, I'd shifted, like, we had over 3 million streams on Spotify and stuff like that, you know, just sort of a really insane sort of level for a band that weren't signed to a major record label. We had songs on playlists with the Foo Fighters and Green Day and Queens of Stone Age and stuff like that, you know, and to see like music that you're playing drums on up there with the bands that you listen to was absolutely mind-blowing. So I just felt like I'd taken it as far as I could. So I still play the drums. I have them set up behind me, and I still play them, but it's, you know, I'm never say never that I'll go back to that life sort of thing, but for the moment it's just something that I do for pleasure, especially in lockdown, because we can't play live at the moment, and so, you know, it's on the back burner, something I do for pleasure, and it'll always be there. I'll always play drums. I'm teaching my 2 girls to play drums now as well. Although I want one of them to be a guitarist so I can have a jam, because 3 drummers is pretty useless, right? So yeah, and many stories. Many stories. Some of them which I can't tell, especially not on here. I'll write. I plan to write about some of them on my blog. So the blog is intended to be a mix of sort of posts about, you know, becoming a DBA, my personal journey about being a DBA, more technical posts, and then some sort of drumming / musical stories as well. But absolutely no regrets. You know, it was absolutely fantastic, and you know, I absolutely love drumming. It's a massive part of who I am, and it always will be. So hence the drumming DBA.
Okay, so who is your favorite drummer?
Well, you know, it's weird really, because all my heroes are guitarists. But if I had to pick one drummer, it would probably be either Nick Mason out of Pink Floyd, because I just like his style. It's very sort of, he's a massively underrated drummer. And then he's not my favorite drummer, but it's probably my favorite album for drumming is Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age. And when I met Dave Grohl, which was backstage at a Foo Fighters gig, so they were headlining a festival in the UK, playing to like 90,000 people, and we had backstage passes, so we were on stage with the Foo Fighters, sort of stood behind their amps watching them play, which was incredible. And then when they came off stage, they invited us all back to their sort of dressing room, and we all went back, and it was a lot of fun. And I was talking to Dave Grohl about his drumming and stuff, and I actually told him that I thought his best drumming wasn't in Nirvana, but it was for Queens of the Stone Age, and he seemed to like that comment. I don't know whether he took it as an insult that I didn't like Nirvana. I do like Nirvana, but it wasn't meant in that way. But yeah, I would say Nick Mason is my favourite overall drummer, but the drumming on Songs for the Deaf by Dave Grohl for Queens of Stone Age is absolutely immense.
Okay, thank you. So this will be my last question. And which one do you think is harder, being a DBA or to learn playing drums?
Well, they're quite similar, I guess, because you know, being a drummer, you're using both your hands, using both your legs, and you know, there's a lot to think about. And the point I got to when we were playing, you know, to sort of, in the last band, we were playing to big audiences, and you would have what you call in-ear monitors. So you would have the track coming through and you play to a click track. So you essentially have like a click in your ears, and you have to play in time to that because everyone else is trying to keep in time. So, you know, there's a lot going on being a drummer, and especially if the parts are quite complicated. Like I say, you're using all your limbs. You're also thinking a lot. You're hitting different things because they make different sounds, and if you hit the wrong thing at the wrong time, it sounds out of place. And I guess being a DBA is a lot like that. You know, it's not, you know, sort of just one thing. You know, there are a lot of different areas, that a lot of plates that you have to keep spinning and stuff. I would say which one's harder? It depends, really. I've been a DBA for less time, so I'd probably say personally being a DBA is harder, because playing the drums now is just so natural to me. I'm not saying I'm an amazing drummer, because I'm not by any stretch, but it's something that comes naturally to me. There are DBAs out there who it just comes naturally to them. It's not something that came naturally to me, and it still doesn't. I have to sort of really study stuff and force myself to sort of really over study things for it to go in. Some things obviously go in easier and stuff like that, but sometimes not. But I'd say probably being a DBA is harder because things change all the time, you know. But they're very similar. It's probably why I like being a DBA.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much for joining me today. I think this was a fantastic session, and hope to see you again in further episodes. And next time with a cool demo.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thanks for having me, mate. I really appreciate it. And
You're welcome.
thanks for everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And like I say, if anyone's got any questions, just drop me a line on the blog or on Twitter or anything like that. I'd be happy to answer it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike.
Right, cheers,
See you
guys.
again.
See you, mate.
Cheers. Bye.